Very good. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today. Appreciate it. I'm, Greg Fordham. I'll be your tour guide for the next, 60 minutes, I suppose, on safeguarding with controlled, unclassified with information. There's a little bit kind of about me in terms of the alphabet soup there and kind of what it means. Just to give you a little background, this month I guess I'm completing my 39th year in defense acquisition, if you can believe that. So, and you probably wonder, well, how does a defense acquisition guy get all that computer crap in it? Well, I've always been kind of a technology guy, but sometime in 2000, the lawyers out here in the world, 20 years after the PC kind of revolutionized the computing industry, the lawyers through the Microsoft trial learned there's this thing called a computer and it's got good information on it. Who knew? So anyway, since then I've been able to take a lot of my kind of technology stuff and cross-sell it over to the lawyers of the world, and I do a lot of different stuff these days, but about half of it is, with trade secrets work. So I do a lot of, computer forensic work, and about half of it is with trade secrets work, or kind of like industrial espionage, kind of more or less, which is kind of what we're here, going to be talking about here. So also just to let you know, I have a lot of articles. I'm published about 70 times. So I have a lot of articles up on my website that deal with this information. In fact, a lot of the information, but not all of what I'll be talking about today, you could find articles off my website, and there would be the address for the URL and whatnot there if you're interested to take a look. All right, so here's kind of how I'm going to run the presentation today. Well, first, I want to do kind of a quick flashback to how we got here. I'll try not to spend too much time doing the history lesson, but just kind of a quick flashback as to how we got here. Then I'm going to take a look at really where we are with the current regs and whatnot. Rest easy, because of the constraints of time, I won't have time to numb your brain or glaze your eyes with a lot of the minutia that might be contained in those rules. And then, just like when you're reading a book, you go to the end to see how it ends. That's where I'm going to go. I'm going to go and we're going to talk about, when you look at these rules, what's missing. Because we are on our 5th iteration of managing to safeguard controlled, unclassified information. And with the 5th iteration here, we're still trying to get the formula right. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk to you about, is what I think is still missing, and why we'll just see if we make it, kind of this time or not. All right, and then I'm going to back up and we're going to go take a look at a couple of the current rule highlights, and other types of shortcomings that I've been able to identify. In fact, this is my second time to speak here. 2 years ago I was here, and I actually kind of focused on the other with highlights a lot more, and talked about some of the surprises there. So today's presentation is a slightly different, focus, because I won't spend quite as much time talking about, the other shortcomings as I did 2 years ago, for example. All right, so how did we get here? Well, first off, the interest in the unclassified information, trying to protect it, kind of started around 2000, and the OMB circular was probably one of the first, documents that kind of described the interest and kind of set out controls and stuff like that for that type of information for the government. And then we had, the FISMA of 2002, and then probably it was the Executive Order 13556 that kind of got into the idea that, could this be extended to the contractors, to the executive agency, and to the contractors, say, themselves. And that's really kind of where DOD got involved, because they were probably one of the first of the executive agencies that came up with rules as to what their contractors were going to have to do to protect controlled unclassified information. CUI, in other words. I'll just use that, type of term, saying to say from here on out. You know, you might want to think whoever was in charge of this stuff probably was from the Army, right? Because Rangers lead the way. Isn't that what we hear? All right. So anyway, that was, say, the first iteration. You can see it was proposed in 2011. It was finalized in 2013. It defined with CUI as controlled technical types of information, and there was a big long definition within categories and stuff like this, and there was issues about how it had to be marked so that, you know, if you're the contractor, you would know if you had it because it was marked. And then also what the first iteration did is it looked at the 853, say the NIST 853 standards, which are the standards, you know, the government would follow for its systems. And there's like 100, to say, and 70 with controls in the 800-53. And they pulled out, kind of DOD pulled out, you know, like 41 of those to impose on its contractors. And that was kind of how things went till we got to the second, you know, iteration in 2015. Kind of what happened is in 2000, you know, like 15, kind of a NIST finally would publish their document for contractors, the 800, say now 171 controls. And it had, you know, like 110 types of controls that contractors were supposed to employ for their networks, you know, they're in their data to protect, you know, all their information. Now, you know, so somewhat interesting is that back, you know, when DOD was doing the first version, public with comments that were cautioning, you know, say DOD that they might be getting too far out in front, that they needed to wait till the NIST people produced their document. And in 2015 they did, and sure enough, DOD has to scamper to kind of change what their rule was. So they managed to propose, to say, a new version in 2015. It managed to get, you know, finalized in 2016, and there was such kind of an outcry and an uproar about it, about what it was going to require contractors to do and the costs that were going to be involved in this area. It got postponed to 2017. Okay, now, some of the things that this did is it managed to, say, now redefine, you know, a CUI as CDI, a controlled defense information, and controlled, say, defense information, they're included CTI, which was the previous version. And then it also adds kind of cloud-based with services. And so then DOD kind of has its own little view of the FedRAMP. It essentially takes, you know, the FedRAMP version, adds a few twists to it, and that's what DOD manages to impose to say its contractors for cloud services. Now the third iteration came around in 2019, and it was finalized in like early, you know, like 2020, and it was scheduled for full like implementation that summer of 2020, and it was going to have a programmatic would phase in over 5 years. Now, and this also is where we got in to start with the CMMC, you know, the Cyber Security Maturity with Model with Certification. This kind of came about because there were concerns. There was a lot of, say now, published types of reports that contractors weren't actually following, you know, the rules and this type of stuff. Say they claimed they were, but, you know, they actually weren't. And so I'm not really sure where they came up with that idea, where anybody managed to come up with that idea. Well, I never saw any, you know, published, you know, reports of empirical data. About the closest thing I saw was, you know, the NDIA, the National Defense, say, Industrial Association, to the Manufacturing Committee, had done a survey of 200 small business, to say, a medium-sized type of business, say, type of contractors. And they had done a survey to see if they were kind of aware of these controls. Now the survey didn't really say who they were talking to or who they surveyed. You know, but essentially, so the survey managed to conclude that something like 63 to 64% of the contractors that were aware of the new rules. So that really only meant that about 36 weren't aware. As I was saying, you know, the survey was not real clear about who they had managed to survey. Had they managed to survey, like presidents and also CEOs? Had they managed to survey CTOs? Had they managed to survey contracts people? Because actually probably of those three groups, I would have just expected the contracts people to be the ones who may or may not know if they even have that sort of requirement in their contracts. Because remember, if you were a subcontractor, you might not have these controls passed down to you by the prime or the upper tier sub if they weren't going to be, say, providing you with, CUI. So it's quite possible that you could have subs, as an example, who don't know about the rules because they don't have the requirement. And it's also, there with a multi-year contract, it takes a little while for these rules to filter their way down, through the layers. So you could have had, like subcontractors again, who are managing to work for people doing, like multi-year, say types of contracts, and maybe the prime contract that was started was before these requirements actually managed to even come up. So anyway, I'm not really too sure about how accurate all the concern was, and if there was a good like kind of reason why maybe people weren't, to say, aware about it. And but anyway, from all this, there was a lot of things about smaller businesses. There were the weak link in the chain. Different contractors, particularly small types of businesses, that were not complying with it, and whatnot. And so that's how even, say, the certification came up with the idea, not certification, say the survey came up with the idea that maybe there should be, say, a certification type requirement for contractors to ensure that they actually complied with the standards. As far as I can tell, that's really where we came up with the idea to have the, the third party, say, attestation and a CMMC type of requirement. So then we went to the fourth, say, iteration, because you can imagine under the third, all the contractors were going to have to get, like certified to do awards. I mean, to say receive awards and to do any work. Well, there's a lot of contractors in DOD. I don't know that anybody knows an exact number, but it's in the neighborhood of like 100,000. Might be 70 or 80,000, but it's a huge number. And so to stand that up, get all the reviewing processes going on, get people certified and reviewed, whatever else, and get it into a short kind of a period of time, say, because they were trying to do, was kind of a large, undertaking, probably a little too large. And, there was some look trying to see if they could do this with their existing types of resources with DCMA, DCAA, and this type of stuff. And, we ultimately went to, say, the accreditation board and this type of stuff. But anyway, so the fourth iteration is kind of like, well, first is proposed there within January 20, say now 22. So 2 years kind of after the third, yes, they finally realized this isn't quite going to happen this way, so we're going back to the old way. We're going to just go back to, say, the NIST, say now 171, because to the third, besides doing that, there had also tried to, say, incorporate standards from, ISO and more from, the 800 with 53 and all this type of stuff. So they kind of just backed up. And the idea was going to be that here in the summer of 20 with 23 would come out with the fifth, iteration, where hopefully there we would go back to the CMMC, the certification, the third party with attestation, and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's not running yet, although on July 24th, DOD sent their proposed rules to like OMB to start the rulemaking process. So far, I've not seen any, like public type release about what is in that proposed rulemaking. So, and we may not get an idea until about, say, September. So that might be kind of where it comes out. So right now, we're still managing to look back at the older types of requirements. So that's kind of how we got to where we are, and now where are we? All right, well, for like federal systems, well, we have kind of a patchwork. There are different types of requirements here. There for federal systems, they have to comply there with NIST 800-53. And then if you're a cloud with computing with service, you've got like FedRAMP that you have to deal with. DoD, as I mentioned, kind of has their own, say, version to the FedRAMP, and then you get into the contractor systems where you have both the FAR version for the FCI, the Federal Contracting with Information, and then you've got the DFARS for CUI, and there's how the the clauses, or I should say, here are the clauses that if you're a contractor, you get put into your contract, and this determines really what you have to do. So if you're a contractor there, you'll get the 7,000, say now 8 clause, and essentially that means, that if you manage to offer a proposal that you're going to actually kind of follow, the 171 rules, then you can't comply with them. Say the 7009 is an interesting clause. You should keep that in mind for some stuff I'm going to chat about here in the future, because it's essentially kind of a confidentiality thing. If you're a third party entity kind of helping do the assessment on a cyber incident and you're trying to figure out what's going on, you're supposed to be discreet and not manage to reveal the information that you may have found out. And they tried to kind of say, I'll make it very clear, like in that clause that you could be in deep trouble, as they would say. Now, say the 7012 clause is the one that actually manages to impose all the safeguarding types of requirements on us, and imposes, say the 700, to the 800, to the 171 with controls. Then you get into to the assessment with requirements. And essentially kind of the first one is that you have to do the assessment and you have to publish, say, your results in the contractor with reporting with system. And then they actually talk about how to do the assessment, or they provide you information there about the assessment. There's essentially kind of a scoring to 110 points, but depending on what you pass or fail on, there's actually about 300 points, say, that you could have pulled back off your score, so it's possible to go with negative. And then you get into the 70 with 21, which is the CMMC requirement to say itself. And as of now, that we don't kind of have anything until the soonest of a 20 with 25. If there is a requirement for CMC, it has to be approved at the say the Undersecretary, Board Defense for the Acquisition and Sustainment. Yeah. All right, and so also as part of for the security controls here, the 14 with families, they're made up for the NIST issue, and I think the issues there within white are things that contractors can probably do fairly well and probably have those. It's probably going to be the yellow ones that I think contractors are going to struggle with, and where all the problems, not all the problems, but kind of where there's going to be an awful lot of issues with cost, say, and otherwise. All right, so now I got all that stuff kind of set up, so now what's missing? Well, one thing I don't see in all these rules is any sort of, say, supply chain considerations. In other words, I don't see anything. Just for example, you've got all these rules that you're supposed to follow, but how do you know that, the switches, the routers, the firewalls, the computers, all the things that you're using, say now in your system, are actually functioning as they're supposed to be functioning? Then you can manage to rely on them. It kind of seems like, if you have all these controls and things you're supposed to do, but the equipment doesn't manage to say would work right, there you've got a problem. And we don't have anything to say like Buy America Act types of issues, say now quality control standards, bounty hunter with provisions, or kind of a logo, type of accreditation, that would be a flag to a contractor. If you're out to go buy equipment, this piece of equipment has a logo that kind of tells me it's a more secure piece of equipment. So now you're probably thinking, oh, well, that's kind of pie in the sky type of stuff. Well, let me show you this article from 2021. Just kind of a starting point here, by the way. Comes out of Broom, whatever his name is. Having a senior moment there, I forget the guy's name. But anyway, in 2010, the U.S. Department of Defense found thousands of its computer servers sending to the military type of network with data to China. The result of code hidden in chips that handled the machine's startup process. Say the machines turned out to be loaded with unauthorized instructions directing each one to secretly copy data about itself and its network and send the information to China, according to 6 former senior officials who described a confidential probe of the incident. The Pentagon found the implant in thousands of servers, according to one, another one said it was ubiquitous. Now that's a big word. Ubiquitous is a big word, right? What does ubiquitous mean? It means everywhere, right? So now it goes on. Each of these distinct attacks had 2 things in common: China and Supermicro Computer Inc., a computer with hardware were manufactured in San Jose, California. All right, so he is an American company, but I guess where's all the components being made? Maybe all the boards were being made in China, or who knows where they were being made. But apparently they had some kind of problem with these boards. And they also shared, there was another trait, the U.S. spy masters discovered the manipulation, but kept them largely secret as they tried to counter each one and learn more about China's capabilities. China's exploitation of products made by Supermicro, as the company is known, has been under federal scrutiny for much of the past decade. So remember, this is a 2021 article for much of the past decade. So here we are, we're putting out rules for contractors to keep your data safe, and here we know about some board problem from some manufacturer. And I'm not so sure that anybody's being aware of it, because I know when you read the article here, Supermicro said, nobody told us, but then of course you don't ever know how much of that they're keeping kind of confidential anyway. Well, as it turned out, let me just go on. So this wasn't a case of a guy stealing a board and soldering a chip on its hotel room. It was architected onto the final device. The chip was blended into the trace on a multi-layered board. Quite sophisticated. So this isn't the type of thing that everybody's going to pick up too easily. All right. Now, as it turns out, Supermicro is not the only one that was having a problem. Now Pentagon supplier that received attention, there was Chinese, Lenovo Group. In 2008, U.S. investigators found the military units in Iraq that were using Lenovo types of laptops in which hardware had been altered. The discovery surfaced later in, a little one noticed, testimony during a U.S. criminal case, a rare public description of a Chinese with hardware attack. So it's not the only one, and I would dare say that those 2 aren't the only one, and there may be an awful lot of others. So, but again, it seems like if we don't have some sort of process in this rulemaking that is trying to help contractors know what hardware to pick, it's kind of like putting a screen door on your submarine, So, all right, so that wasn't the only thing either. Corporate, investigators, they're uncovered yet. Another way that Chinese hackers, they're exploiting Supermicro products. In 2014, executives at Intel, because actually it wasn't just DoD that was finding this stuff. Intel, Apple, and Amazon also managed to report similar problems. But they traced how the security breach, say, in their network to a seemingly routine firmware update downloaded from the super, micro website. Kind of one of our control features that we're supposed to do with these controls, we're supposed to always updating patches. But here we got patches coming in from here that, had problems with them. And again, we don't have any way that we're actually trying to take a look at this stuff to know if what we're doing is right. So APT was 17, and that's not apartment, by the way. Specializes in complex to supply chain attacks, and it often hits multiple targets to reach its intended victims, according to cybersecurity firms. You can read all that. In 2012, the group hacked cybersecurity firm Bit9 in order to get defense contractors protected by Bit9's products. Again, we don't have anything out there that's look at that. Instead, we've got something else going on. Okay, so as it turns out, there in more recent times, this say delivery mechanism is similar to the one used during the recent was SolarWinds hack, in which the Russians, targeted government agencies, and I hate to just kind of read this stuff to you particularly. I think you'll see it up there. But the point is there for the SolarWinds. Oh, the one thing that was interesting here is that for Intel, for the analysis that they were doing, they were only finding it in not all of the super type micro servers they had, that apparently, that they could target certain types of machines, which makes it harder to detect, this type of issue. So perhaps someone contractor that's just out there with this dashboard doing the monitoring system like he's supposed to do, might be harder for the contractor to pick up that he's got this, type of problem. And maybe kind of another reason why maybe we need to have something a little more stuck into the model that we're trying to manage to come up with here. As you can see, the SolarWinds hack is still under investigation, and say the supply chain issues are a big deal in U.S. politics now, and but yet here in this rule we don't have anything that's kind of geared up to help like point us in that particular way. So that would be kind of helpful if we had that type of with information, so that contractors could have kind of like a logo, a type of requirement that they know something about, that this would be a better choice. Just think of all the people that makes like switches and firewalls and routers and boards and this, that, and the other. All right, I got one more here that's also kind of interesting for you. This is more, say, like recent time. Downfall, say, no vulnerability leaves billions of Intel CPUs at risk. So this is kind of another vulnerability that you can see the date here, August 8th, 2023. This is just last week. So this is, say, a vulnerability that's been found in Intel x86 chips that apparently goes back to 2014. So every Intel x86 chip potentially has this, say, no problem with it, although Intel's supposed to have come up with a fix here kind of in recent times, if everybody knows about the fix and knows to patch their systems. And you can see it, what the guy who found the stuff is telling you here, that the vulnerability is ideally suited for theft of encryption keys and passwords. And as part of the research, he developed methods to easily steal 128 and 256-bit AES kind of encryption keys. So now, while there's a possibility for this stuff to be used on an individual, kind of a desktop, type of machine, probably where it really has a bigger payoff is in all those cloud type of computing with storage areas that we were all thinking we're going to be safe or safer. So, and then he comments in the article, so he was just kind of saying, now one person doing the research, think of what a bunch of people doing, the Black Hat group could do, and he was just doing it there for the glory and the notoriety and stuff like that, which kind of gets back to, well, maybe if we had, more kind of with bounty hunter with provisions, perhaps as part of the logo system, what manufacturers would have to make sure they have is kind of like a bounty hunter with provision. Some of them do. I mean, Apple's got that type of deal. For example, they'll pay you if you come in there with a flaw in their stuff, although I've seen articles that there's some discussion about whether or not Apple really pays enough for the big problems that, that are found, and so whether or not they, actually get turned in or people sell the ideas elsewhere. But anyway, if you had kind of a bounty hunter provision, the quality control standards, and something else about these is this particular one, the downfall, actually has kind of a similarity to kind of another, like vulnerability. Spectre and something, I forget what it was, from 2000 with 18. So it has to deal with, the chip's access to the memory, other than how it was storing such information. And then kind of surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly from this, even, this whole, say, idea that there could be kind of a problem with the way chips do that was kind of first, at least, the earliest known incident of it comes out in a IEEE symposium, to say an article in 1995. So that was nearly 30 years ago. And the information there, from the article, was based on kind of a lot of work done with NSA's trusted with product, to say, evaluation program. So somebody knows, already knows how to do the evaluations and do this type of stuff. Why not be able to set this type of information up there through the rules or through kind of whatever, so contractors helpfully know what to pick, to add stuff to their systems. All right, so now, and also one thing is, okay, so if we also had, the bounty hunter type provisions, with our guy here that found, a downfall, well, him, those other people, perhaps downfall could have been found much sooner, sooner to 2014 rather than here in 2022. And also, if maybe you had kind of a bounty hunter had the bounty hunter with provision, you could pay him with some money and put that clause on, the 7009 clause that has to keep him kind of quiet, because kind of last week he was at Black Hat in Vegas, telling everybody how to exploit this particular, vulnerability. All right, so we have a few things that are trying to be improved through the supply chain, like in these clauses, there the contractors aren't supposed to use the Kaspersky stuff, Huawei. Now we've got TikTok with the ByteDance. We've got the new executive order and the NIST 2018. I'm sorry, I meant to also mention. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back on this slide. So the NIST has this document out for the supply chain to risk management. The 800 say 161, but that's actually more, in my mind, more of an awareness document rather than a solutions document. So even if you get contractors to try to follow that, I don't think that we're going to have any type of solution for the issue. All right, so now let's so we have that issue about for the supply chain. There were types of concerns. So I'm not necessarily trying to say that we don't need to have controls. We can have controls, but I think we need to maybe have more practicality about how we're going to kind of implement this type of stuff. Do we really have to have techniques that are going to kind of lock down the small type of business with cable harness with manufacturer, when in fact there's still, even if they adopt all these controls, there's still other ways, other vulnerabilities to their systems, that might be just as big, to say, if not bigger. So we need to have a little more practicality, I think, in the DoD rule. They're from the business standpoint, we always try to focus on an 80-20 rule. Let's see if we can solve 80% of our problems with 20% of our effort. Sometimes with DoD, I think we get to where we're doing it just the opposite. We're going to solve with 20% with 80% of our effort. So maybe a couple of other things for the practicality aspect. Let's get a better, a definition for, a CUI. Sorry, I keep calling it that. So here's kind of what the current definition is for CUI. And you can see it's kind of long and convoluted. It's got a lot of parts to it, and it can be hard to figure out if you have a CUI or not. Although, again, if you're getting it from the government, it's supposed to be marked. So it should be easier to spot, although are they always going to be, properly marking? Then I saw this, the other day on the DoD, a CIO's saying on a homepage, and he's got a fairly simple, a definition of CUI. And so I'm just kind of thinking, which one are we going to go with? But I think we would be better off having a simpler kind of a definition than a more complex, type of definition. All right, say the third-party, attestation deal. Is that kind of a bridge too far? Okay, let's just say that there's 100,000 with contractors. And what is it going to take if you have to have, a certification every 3 years? And that means they've got to be doing 33,000 contractors every year for certification. Now, there's going to be kind of a presentation at 4 o'clock back in this room from guys from the ecosystem who, if you read, say, the description for their presentation, they talk about how the accreditation, body now, is comprised of, like 600 with organizations and has a head count of 3,500 people. Well, if you actually have 3,500 people and they're doing kind of a review a month, each of them, does a review a month, well, then you could probably get to 33,000, that way. But the reality is the 35, saying, type of person, type of head count, I'm sure there's kind of management in there, overhead in there, there's trainers in there. So how many of the 3,500 are actually going to be the evaluators is not real clear. Now you can, believe it or not, DoD kind of already has people doing evaluations on contractor with business systems. In fact, there are 6 different contractor with business systems that are currently and have been for an awful lot of years that DoD does. And those kind of 6 systems are the government property, the earned value, the purchasing system, and then accounting, estimating, and material management. The yellow ones are being done by DCMA, and the white ones are being done by DCAA. And I don't really know, even though DCMA has the head count of like 11,000, they do a lot of different stuff. I don't really know how many of the 11,000 are actually doing these types of reviews. For the government, like property review, you can see that they do 1,000 of those a year. But I've always kind of thought that, say the property review was fairly, simple and straightforward. Come in and see if the contractor can actually account for all the government property that he has. Say the other ones, the earned, value, saying the purchasing system, those get to be much more involved. They're also much more selective about what contractors would qualify. They're usually bigger contractors, bigger events, this type of stuff. And also, I should say, the government, property type review, I would probably put that about the same type of level as kind of like a medium size of review, to say of assessment. Remember, there's 3 types of assessments that can be done to see if a contractor is managing to comply with the safeguarding rules. There's the low, which is if it's a self-assessment. There's a medium, which DoD personnel will actually take a look at the security system document and just kind of take a look at that to see if it looks like the contractor is managing to comply. Then there's the high-level type of review where besides, the SSD, they also manage to come in and do, like field work to take a look at specific examples to see if the contractor actually is doing, the things, that are required by the review. So, as I was going to say, so the government property is about what I would consider to be the equivalent of a medium, but all the rest of these are more like what I would consider to be a high, because there's going to be kind of a demonstration by the contractor, kind of like the SSD type of review. Then there'll be people who come in and do the audits for a few weeks, could be months even, and then there'll be reports and recommendations and saying a reconciliation between here's what the reviewers think, here's what the contractor thinks, and all that type of stuff. So the point is that I think you maybe have some places out there where you can get to some metrics to see actually if the 3,500 head count is going to be able to do the task this time, and kind of say, now what kind of task is it going to be? If perhaps it was stratified so that for some types of contractors, self-assessment is still good. Other types of contractors, maybe like a medium is good, and so it just comes down to like very few who actually get the full type of review there and get a high, type of evaluation. Perhaps you can do it with 35. But I just kind of wonder again whether or not we're going to be able to stand this thing up, whether or not there's far too, if there's a lot more contractors than they think, or they're prepared to think about. How about the scope of the contractors? I mean, kind of right now, it's a one-size-fits-all type of deal, or at least as best we can tell. So hopefully that maybe they're going to kind of, also kind of stratify this type more. But I know there's more. There has been discussion about kind of like a level 1 review, which would be more like the FCI type stuff. Most people would fall into the level 2, though, which is full, 171, with types of controls, and then there would be the 3, which would go beyond that. I know every time I read an article about this type of stuff or go to a presentation, a lot of them deal with this type of comparison. The F-35 on the left and the Chinese J-20 on the right. And there's comments about how, everything in the J-20 has been essentially stolen from the F-35. And then they want to blame the small business, a contractor is the weak link in the chain for having gotten that. Well, I think if you could actually push all this thing down to piece parts, to say mom and pop stores, that still doesn't tell you how to put them all together. So I know if I take a look at this picture, I'm kind of thinking it's not all small business cable harness manufacturers that they're getting the data from. And if they are, why does he have all that data? Actually, they're getting a lot of this data from the big guys too. So there's kind of, more of an issue there. And so we need to kind of think more about how we're going to treat large contractors, small contractors, to commercial, they're non-commercial. I mean, DOD wants to apply these types of rules to the commercial, contractors as well. They want to say, you can come to us and sell to us, all this type of stuff if you, abide by our rules. Well, if you've got, say, a commercial contractor, he's kind of bringing to you his type of product. So it's not like this is anything new. Typically to qualify for the commercial, product, type of exemption, you can't have, say, like material differences between what you supply to DOD and actually what you sell to the public. So I think you really have to take a look at it, perhaps not including to commercial contractors. I'm not too sure, that I'm managed to convince that you need to have, say, commercial contractors, subject to this type of stuff. And then you also kind of, well, I'll cover that in a minute. So, then you get into things like, scope of controls. Well, a lot of these, when you look at it, there's kind of like geared more for the typical IT, IP type of stuff, the normal type of network, the loose files, the endpoints, this type of stuff. But actually, for the DoD world, this stuff can, covers all types of your systems. Say your business systems, and even the factory and shop floor control. And I just kind of know when you're taking a bunch of IT people, I don't think a lot of them they're going to be too well prepared, trained with whatever to do with like business systems, or to say, and also like shop floor controls. they're the manufacturing or industrial, types of systems. So I'm not, so sure that these controls, they're accomplish much for us, or the people who are going to be doing the evaluations that they're going to bring much to the table. All right, so the dispute type of resolution, you don't see that in these rules either. Essentially there's going to be, say, decisions made. There's going to be a decision made that you've got this type of score that you pass or you don't pass, and if you don't pass, you don't do business, you don't get awards, you don't get this, that, or the other. All right, and so how is that process being done? If you look at all the other contractor with business, say, system reviews, there's usually kind of an administrative clause that sets that up. That kind of explains what everybody there can expect, how the work will be done, how the findings are going to be, to say, communicated, how they can be challenged, how they can be reconciled, how can they can be, say, like, be resolved, and this type of stuff. And you just don't see that in the rules that we have out there right now. And you're probably going to have say, disputes. There are a lot of situations. For example, let's take a look at the standards and interpretation themselves. All right, this is one standard from the security controls, 3.1.8. You can see here's what the requirement is. Say, now, limit unsuccessful logon attempts. That is what the control requires. Limit unsuccessful logon attempts. You can see that there's, to say, a discussion here, but if you read it, you'll see it's may this, may that, may this, may this. So essentially it comes down to this is a performance type of spec. It's not a detailed spec. There's not a lot of information about what the contractor has to do to actually, say, accomplish with this control. So if I were to have, say, now, limit like unsuccessful, say logon attempts, if I do anything to address that issue, I should pass, even though maybe it might not really do too much of a good job. So I'm concerned that what's going to happen is that if you go to the 171 rules, there's a mapping table out there, and it takes, say, the requirement, and it maps it out to here's where that control was further discussed in the 853 controls, and also they're in the ISO controls. And if you go to 853 and if you go to the ISO controls, there's a lot more with details. And of course, the concern I have is that whoever these certifying people are, saying these are testers, and how they're being trained, even though I don't know that yet, I'm just concerned that they're going to be taking, say, these mapping tables and putting over and try to impose upon the contractor that here's the procedures that you have to do, and if you don't do these, you don't pass. The problem is when you look at the mapping tables, you see this particular provision in the mapping table itself. The mapping tables are included for informational purposes and do not impart additional security requirements beyond those requirements defined in Chapter 3. Well, the Chapter 3 requirement is 3.1.8, limit unsuccessful logon attempts, end of story. So it's nice that you have all that other stuff that you can go and take a look at if you like to. It's nice that before going to, say, work each day that you can, check the weather. But if you don't have a contract type of requirement to bring an umbrella to work, you don't have to bring an umbrella to work. All right, and you're going to have the same type of stuff, I think, in say, the CUI interpretation. Do you have, I keep saying this, I'm sorry. Do you have a CUI or do you not have a CUI? I think that's going to be also kind of an issue. I know I always like to try and tell people, view it with narrowly. Don't try and do this thing so that everybody there in the organization is going to be cleared for this stuff, because we'll talk about that in a minute. And so this gets to be down to whether or not, what is this rule actually going to accomplish? Is it going to kind of make it more secure, or is this really going to be just another way for DoD to possibly circumvent competition and contracting act? Believe it or not, throughout history, this isn't something they do every year, but throughout history, there have been other issues where they've tried to come up with different ways to kind of, to direct places in the direction that they want them to direct them to. Is this going to be a way that they want to direct their awards to people they think, that they want to do it to based on whatever their clearance is for these controls? And then, of course, you're also, if you can keep this up, you don't take care of all this stuff, are you going to be, damaging to the industrial base? You're already kind of stressed there with the industrial base, or are you going to be damaging? And a couple different ways that you could be damaging it is like, okay, DoD does contract with a lot of, like foreign contractors as well. Are the foreign contractors going to be subject to the same review standards as, like U.S. companies? Back in the 90s, we had this type of issue with costs were justified with contracts and DCAA going to places like France, to say in Germany, to review, cost techniques being used by those firms. And this stuff is all kind of handled there by treaty, and the French and the Germans were big ones to stiff arm with DOD and said, you're not coming in, DCA, there's not one coming in to look at, we'll have our own people go and take a look, and we'll tell you if they're doing a good job. And so we're going to have the same type of problem here when DOD manages to contract with foreign firms. Now, another issue is they just, DOD has this idea that people are just going to want to sell to DOD. So they'll jump through these hoops to sell to DOD. Well, these days we have, say, commercial items. Back before the 90s, in fact, DOD and government as a whole had spent a lot of time trying to come up with a commercial product type of exemption. And they weren't coming up with it very successfully. It wasn't until mid to late, say the 90s, that we had the FASA and the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act and the Federal Acquisition Reform Act that brought in to the commercial products and stuff like this. And that was, of course, it took a while for the regs to come up and all this kind of stuff. But now they're out there. The point of it is you take, for example, say there are a lot of stories about problems that DOD had getting contractors to work with them. I know back in the 90s, I could do kind of presentations, and if there were contracting officers there in the audience, they would frequently talk about how they can't get people to do jobs for them. Kind of an infamous story goes back to the first Desert War, and what they were wanting to do is they were wanting to cut down with fratricide, what they wanted to give all the soldiers GPS with devices so we know where everybody's at to cut down on the friendly fire. So DOD asked their contractors, what's it going to take to put a GPS device out there? So the contractors go out there. It's going to cost $34,000. It's going to weigh 17 pounds, and it'll take 18 months to field. Well, the war's going to be over by the time that happens. They did get a GPS device. It was part of the contribution made by Japan to the effort. Remarkably, Japan bought it from Motorola here in the States. Motorola wouldn't sell to DOD because of all the regulatory requirements that they had, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. You're going to have the same kind of problem, or you could have the same kind of problem. I think you have to watch out about how you're going to implement these rules. Otherwise, you're going to further constrict, and you're not going to have the people that you want to be doing this work. Also, there's the issue about the human factor, and that is that remember that every person is a potential failure point. Through the rules, they talk about segmenting the network, particularly public places to the network, to kind of separate them. I often kind of think contractors ought to also manage to restrict their CUI aspects, kind of reduce the portions that make the target smaller, because there's a lot of problems if you have a cyber incident. Okay, so here's the other types of shortcomings. I don't have time to go into this. I talked about this two years ago, and that is essentially paragraph B is what we focus on all the time, the CUI controls. But from C on around to M, there's a lot of dynamite there. And I only have time to talk about one of them, all right? and I mean, from a contractor's type perspective, there's a lot of dynamite there. So first off is how about what's a cyber incident? Okay, because when you have a cyber incident, contractor has a cyber incident, he's supposed to report that the cyber incident that kind of has occurred. All right, so here's what a cyber incident really is. Actions taken through the use of computer networks that result in a compromise, that's one, or an actual or potentially adverse effect on an information system and or information residing therein. So essentially, it's got a compromise, and we have a definition of what a compromise is, which is an unauthorized, say, disclosure, or you've got something that is the or. And essentially, the or is essentially going to be a denial of service attack, perhaps kind of like a ransomware type of, something that, that's pretty obvious. But to get to the other one, say the compromise, you're going to need to forensics to do the work. Because if you can't tell about that you've had a compromise, well, then you don't have a cyber incident. And there's no kind of motivation for contractors to tell you, I've had a cyber incident. I can't tell that there's actually been a compromise in your stuff. So 3.6 is where all the incident response data is at. But kind of say now once again, here's what the control is. Establish an operational incident handling capability. It goes on just a little bit beyond that. But it's very performance-based. It's not very detailed. If you look at all the NIST documents that I've identified, these are very basic kind of stuff. It's not very detailed at all. So you get a contractor compliant with this, he's not going to have the capability to assess whether he's got a cyber incident. You're never going to have the reporting of a cyber incident, quite frankly. And there's a couple of reasons that the computer to forensics is so important. First, they determine if you have, say, the cyber incident, and then also it helps, say, the security people, design their security plan so they can actually do a detection. There's a lot of things out there in, say, the security world these days that really thwart a computer forensic type of examination. So if you're not savvy to that, you're going to come up with something really, really strong, and you're going to kind of thwart your issue and not be able to do it. So here we are at the summary. All right, first off, CUI is still in flux. We don't really know what the final rule is going to be yet, but say the solution looks like it's going to require more than stringent, say, security controls on contractors or requiring third-party attestation. We need to strengthen issues for the supply chain, and we need to bring more practical considerations into the deal, such as streamline and stratify to the CUI definition, streamline and stratify to the security controls, to match what the CUI definition is. I think you ought to just jettison the third-party, attestation type of requirement. It'd be fine to do reviews and audits and stuff like this, but to have that up front, I think you're really asking for trouble unless you do something to really scale it back and stratify it. And finally, design to match the formal and informal system. The formal system is the way it's supposed to work. The informal system is the way it actually works. You make things too complicated, the informal system takes over. And so we need to come up with something that hopefully people will find that the informal system will be exactly what the formal system is. I'm out of time. I do have 60 seconds, but probably less than that. I'll be around for a while if anybody has any questions. And if not, now, I'll see you at happy hour, and I can tell you then and reveal my potions and solutions for surviving 39 years in defense contracting.
Thank you, Greg.